Chapter 1. Florence before the plague. A city at its peak. In the early years of the 1300s, Florence stood like a jewel in the heart of Europe, alive, wealthy, and bursting with confidence. Long before the shadow of the Black Death crept across its walls, the city believed itself unstoppable. Merchants, bankers, artists, and craftsmen filled its narrow streets, convinced that Florence was not just surviving the medieval world, but mastering it. Every morning, the city woke to noise and movement. Market stalls opened at dawn, their wooden tables stacked with bread, cheese, olives, wool, and silk. The air carried the mixed smells of fresh food, animal waste, smoke from hearth fires, and the nearby Arno River. Horses and carts pushed through crowds of people, while traders shouted prices and news traveled faster than any official announcement. Florence was crowded, dangerously so. But no one saw this as a weakness. To the people of the city, density meant prosperity. Florence's wealth flowed from trade and banking. Gold coins passed from hand to hand, financing businesses across Europe. Powerful families built grand homes and sponsored churches, art, and public works. New buildings rose steadily, symbols of confidence and ambition. The city felt modern by medieval standards, organized, productive, and proud. Life was hard, but it felt meaningful, and most citizens believed tomorrow would be better than today. Religion shaped daily life, but it lived comfortably beside commerce. Church bells structured the hours of the day, calling people to prayer, weddings, funerals, and festivals. Faith was strong, yet it did not slow business. Instead, it justified success. Many believed wealth was a sign of divine favor, proof that Florence had earned God's blessing. This belief would later prove tragically fragile. Despite its greatness, Florence was also deeply vulnerable. Hygiene, as understood today, did not exist. Waste was dumped into streets or rivers. Rats thrived in homes, markets, and storage areas. Fleas were everywhere, unnoticed and ignored. Houses were packed tightly together, with entire families sharing small, poorly ventilated spaces. Illness was common, but rarely questioned. People accepted sickness as part of life, never imagining it could arrive on a scale that would challenge death itself. Medical knowledge offered little protection. Doctors relied on ancient texts and theories about bad air and imbalanced bodily fluids. Treatments were based on tradition, not evidence. Yet confidence remained high. Florence had survived wars, famines, and political chaos. Why would disease be any different? Social divisions ran deep. The wealthy lived in stone houses with private courtyards, while the poor crowded into wooden structures along narrow alleys. Still, plague-free Florence functioned, laborers worked, children played. Festivals filled public squares with music and color. Weddings were celebrated loudly, funerals quickly forgotten. Life moved fast, and death, though familiar, did not dominate the imagination. Perhaps most dangerous of all was the city's sense of security. Florence was connected to the wider world through trade routes stretching across Europe. Ships and caravans arrived constantly, bringing spices, cloth, ideas, and, unknowingly, threats. Travelers were welcomed, goods were unpacked, and no one thought to ask what invisible passengers might have come along. In hindsight, Florence before the plague feels like a city holding its breath, unaware of what was coming. The streets were alive, the economy strong, the people hopeful. But beneath the noise and confidence lay conditions perfect for disaster. Crowding, ignorance, and an unshakable belief that the worst could never happen here. When death finally arrived, it would not come as a warning. It would come quietly, slipping into this proud city through the same doors that once welcomed wealth and opportunity. And Florence, at the height of its power, would soon learn how fragile that power truly was. Chapter 2. The Arrival of the Black Death. A silent enemy enters Florence. The Black Death did not announce itself when it arrived in Florence. There were no alarms, no warnings carved into stone, no sense that history was about to change forever. Instead, it slipped quietly into the city, hidden among trade goods, travelers, and the daily routines that kept Florence alive. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, the enemy was already inside the walls. Florence was deeply connected to the wider European world. Merchants traveled constantly, ships docked in nearby ports, and caravans arrived with silk, spices, and precious metals. These trade routes were the lifeblood of the city's wealth, but they also became the pathways of death. Somewhere far beyond Florence, the plague had already begun its journey, moving from port to port, city to city, carried by rats and the fleas that sighed on them. No one could see it. No one understood it. At first, the signs were easy to ignore. A merchant fell ill shortly after returning from a journey. A dock worker died suddenly. A household lost a servant to a fever that burned too hot and too fast. Florence was no stranger to sickness, and these deaths did not yet feel unusual. Doctors offered familiar explanations: bad air, seasonal imbalance, exhaustion. Life went on. Then the symptoms became impossible to dismiss. People began to fall ill without warning. High fevers struck suddenly, followed by intense weakness. Painful swellings, later known as buboes, appeared under arms, in the groin, and around the neck. Dark spots spread across the skin, signs that the body was failing from the inside. Some victims died within days, others within hours. The speed was terrifying. Fear crept into conversations, whispered in markets and church doorways. Families noticed that entire households were dying together. Neighbors stopped visiting one another. Shopkeepers closed early. The streets, once loud with trade, grew tense and watchful. Florence had seen hardship before, but this felt different. This felt uncontrollable. Doctors were among the first to panic. Their training offered no answers. Traditional remedies, herbs, bloodletting, scented oils, failed completely. Some physicians fled the city. Others stayed but avoided patients, examining them from a distance, terrified of touching infected bodies. Medical authority collapsed almost overnight, leaving people to rely on rumor and desperation. As deaths increased, denial turned into dread. Bells rang constantly for funerals, their sound blending into a single, endless echo of loss. Bodies were carried through streets on carts, wrapped hurriedly in cloth. Gravediggers worked until exhaustion, then died themselves. Cemeteries filled faster than prayers could be spoken. The most horrifying realization came slowly. The disease was spreading between people. Those who cared for the sick often became sick themselves. Families that stayed together died together. The act of love, touching, comforting, staying close, became deadly. Florence, a city built on human connection, was being torn apart by it. Rumors flooded the city. Some claimed the plague was poison brought by foreigners. Others believed it was punishment from God. Astrologers blamed the stars. No explanation brought comfort because none offered a solution. The disease did not listen to reason or faith. It moved freely, ignoring wealth, status, and reputation. The streets of Florence began to change. Fear replaced confidence. People crossed the road to avoid one another. Windows were shuttered. Doors were sealed with symbols and prayers. The city that once welcomed travelers now feared every stranger, every sound of coughing, every unexplained death. By the time Florence truly understood that the Black Death had arrived, it was already too late. The plague had rooted itself deep within the city's crowded homes and narrow alleys. There would be no stopping it now, only enduring it. The silent enemy had entered Florence unnoticed, and soon it would demand a price unlike anything the city had ever paid. Chapter 3. Streets of Death, Daily Life. During the Plague. As the Black Death tightened its grip on Florence, daily life collapsed into something unrecognizable. The city that once overflowed with noise, color, and movement became a place ruled by silence, fear, and the constant presence of death. What had begun as isolated sickness now consumed every street, every home, and every mind. The transformation was sudden and brutal. Markets that once buzzed with trade stood half empty. Stalls remained closed, their owners either dead or too afraid to leave their homes. Bread became scarce, fresh water harder to find. The poor suffered first, but soon even wealthy households found themselves trapped behind locked doors, cut off from servants, supplies, and safety. Florence was no longer a city. It was a collection of isolated survivors. The streets told the story better than any words could. Bodies lay where people had fallen, sometimes left for days because no one dared to touch them. The smell of death hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. Carts rolled slowly through neighborhoods, collecting the dead like unwanted cargo. Often the drivers were prisoners or desperate men paid to do the work no one else would. Many of them would soon join the bodies they carried. Families were destroyed from the inside. Parents watched children die. Children watched parents collapse and never rise again. In countless homes, the sick were abandoned, not because they were unloved, but because staying meant certain death. Doors were shut. Cries for help went unanswered. Florence learned a new, cruel rule. Survival meant distance. Church bells rang constantly, marking deaths so frequent that they lost individual meaning. Funerals became rushed, anonymous affairs. Priests could not keep up. Some refused to perform last rites, terrified of infection. Faith remained, but comfort faded. Even prayer felt dangerous when spoken too close to another person. Hospitals overflowed and then failed entirely. With doctors gone or powerless, care fell to anyone brave or foolish enough to try. Women, servants, monks, and volunteers tended to the dying, knowing their efforts would likely cost them their lives. Many accepted this fate calmly. Others worked in terror. All were overwhelmed. Social order broke down rapidly. Laws were ignored. Crimes went unpunished. Some took advantage of the chaos, looting empty homes and abandoned shops. Others gave away their possessions, believing the end was near. Florence swung between cruelty and generosity, selfishness and sacrifice, often within the same street. Fear changed human behavior in disturbing ways. People avoided eye contact. Friends crossed the street to avoid one another. A cough could clear a room instantly. Trust vanished. Every stranger felt like a threat, every familiar face a possible carrier of death. Love, once a source of strength, became a risk. And yet, life did not stop completely. In rare moments, people laughed, drank, and clung to pleasure as a form of rebellion against despair. Some believed tomorrow did not matter. Others believed joy itself was an act of survival. These moments were brief, fragile, and often followed by tragedy. Florence during the plague was a city living minute to minute. No plans were made, no future imagined. Survival became the only goal, and even that felt uncertain. The streets, once symbols of prosperity and pride, became pathways of loss and memory. This was the heart of the disaster. Not just the number of deaths, but the way the plague rewrote what it meant to be human. Florence was learning, painfully and irreversibly, that civilization could unravel faster than it had ever been built. Chapter 4. Faith, Fear, and False Cures. As the Black Death continued to devour Florence, fear pushed people toward answers wherever they could be found. When medicine failed and reason collapsed, the city turned desperately to faith, superstition, and hope, no matter how fragile or dangerous that hope might be. In the absence of understanding, belief became both a refuge and a weapon. For many Florentines, the plague could only mean one thing: divine punishment. People believed God was angry, angered by greed, pride, and moral decay. Churches filled with worshippers seeking forgiveness and mercy. Confessions lasted for hours. Public prayers echoed through the streets. Some believed that repentance alone could stop the disease, and they clung to this belief with all the strength they had left. Processions became common. Groups of men and women marched through the city barefoot, chanting prayers, carrying crosses, and begging God to lift the curse. Among them were flagellants, people who whipped their own backs until they bled, believing that pain and suffering would earn divine mercy. These acts were dramatic, public, and deeply emotional. But instead of stopping the plague, they often helped spread it further as crowds gathered and disease passed silently between bodies. At the same time, fear gave rise to false cures. With no real medical solutions, anyone claiming knowledge became powerful. Healers sold potions made from herbs, vinegar, and crushed minerals. Some advised carrying flowers to protect against bad air. Others claimed certain stones, symbols, or spoken words could prevent infection. Desperate citizens spent their last coins on promises that offered comfort, not cures. Doctors, what few remained, were trapped by outdated theories. They believed the plague traveled through poisoned air, so they burned incense and wore masks stuffed with herbs. Bloodletting, already dangerous in healthy times, was widely practiced, weakening patients who might have otherwise survived. The more people suffered, the more extreme the treatments became. Astrology also gained influence. Scholars studied the stars, claiming that rare planetary alignments had corrupted the atmosphere and caused the plague. These explanations felt intelligent and distant, offering a sense of order in chaos. But like prayer and potions, they changed nothing. Fear soon turned into suspicion. Outsiders, minorities, and the poor were blamed. Some believed foreigners had poisoned wells. Others accused certain groups of spreading the disease deliberately. This fear-driven hatred deepened social fractures, turning neighbor against neighbor. The plague did not just kill bodies, it poisoned trust. Ironically, faith and superstition also offered comfort. For those who had lost everything, belief provided meaning. It explained suffering when logic could not. It promised justice beyond death. In a city where tomorrow felt uncertain, the idea of eternal order was deeply appealing. Yet as the months passed, even faith was tested. People prayed and still died. Churches filled and still emptied. God, it seemed, was silent. Florence was forced to confront a terrifying possibility, that not everything had a reason, and not every disaster could be explained or controlled. Chapter 4 reveals one of the darkest truths of the Black Death. When knowledge fails, fear fills the gap. Florence's search for answers led it through devotion, delusion, and despair, and in the end, none of them could stop what was already written into the city's fate. Chapter 5 The Collapse of Society. When Florence lost control. By the time the Black Death reached its peak, Florence was no longer functioning as a society. What had once been a structured, governed, and disciplined city began to unravel under the sheer weight of death. Laws existed on paper, but in the streets, order had vanished. Fear ruled where authority once stood. Government officials were among the first to disappear. Some fled to the countryside, hoping distance would save them. Others fell ill and died, leaving offices empty and decisions unmade. Courts stopped operating. Contracts meant nothing. With no one left to enforce rules, Florence slipped into a state where survival mattered more than obedience. The idea of civic duty collapsed alongside the bodies in the streets. The wealthy abandoned the city in large numbers. Entire noble families locked their homes and escaped to rural villas, sealing themselves off from the suffering below. Their departure drained Florence of leadership, resources, and stability. Those who remained, the poor, the sick, the trapped, were left to face the plague alone. Class divisions, once sharp but functional, became cruel and absolute. Economic life ground to a halt. Workshops closed, trade routes went silent. Gold lost its meaning when there was nothing left to buy. Skilled workers died faster than they could be replaced. Fields went unharvested. Food shortages became common, compounding fear with hunger. Florence, once a center of European commerce, became economically paralyzed. Families broke apart under impossible choices. Some parents abandoned sick children. Some children fled dying homes. Marriages ended not through divorce, but death or fear. Inheritance laws became meaningless as entire bloodlines vanished. Homes stood empty, their former lives erased in days. Florence was losing not just people, but memory. Crime surged in the absence of consequence. Thieves looted abandoned houses. Gangs roamed at night, stealing from the dead and dying alike. Violence increased, not out of cruelty alone, but desperation. When survival feels uncertain, morality bends. Florence learned how thin the line was between civilization and chaos. At the same time, moments of unexpected humanity appeared. Strangers cared for strangers. Some shared food with neighbors they had never spoken to before. Others volunteered to bury the dead, knowing the risk. These acts did not stop the collapse, but they proved that compassion had not completely died. Even in ruin, Florence still contained fragments of its former soul. The greatest loss, however, was trust. People no longer believed in institutions, leaders, or even one another. Every interaction felt dangerous. Every knock at the door inspired terror. Society depends on cooperation, and the plague destroyed that foundation piece by piece. As months passed, Florence became a city of survivors rather than citizens. People stopped thinking in terms of future generations or shared goals. Life narrowed to the present moment. Eat if you can. Hide if you must. Pray if it helps. This mindset marked the true collapse. Not when buildings fell, but when collective identity vanished. The Black Death did not conquer Florence with armies or fire. It dismantled the city quietly, through absence. Absence of leaders, absence of workers, absence of law, absence of hope. By the time the worst had passed, Florence was still standing, but it was no longer the city it had been. What remained was a broken society, forced to rebuild from silence, loss, and the haunting knowledge that everything it once trusted had failed when it mattered most. Chapter 6. After the Plague. A changed Florence. When the Black Death finally began to loosen its grip on Florence, it did not leave behind relief. It left behind silence. The bells that once rang endlessly for the dead slowly stopped, not because grief had ended, but because there were fewer people left to mourn. Streets that had been filled with carts of bodies now stood empty. Doors remained shut, not out of fear alone, but because no one was left inside to open them. Florence had survived, but survival came at a devastating cost. Entire neighborhoods were gone. Historians would later estimate that nearly half of Florence's population perished during the plague years. Skilled artisans, merchants, priests, doctors, children. No group was spared. Families that had lived in the city for generations vanished completely, leaving homes abandoned and businesses forgotten. The social fabric of Florence had been torn apart, and stitching it back together would take decades. Yet from this destruction came a strange and unexpected transformation. With so many workers dead, labor became valuable. Survivors suddenly found themselves in demand. Wages rose. Common people gained bargaining power they had never known before. The rigid social hierarchy of medieval Florence began to crack. Wealth and opportunity slowly shifted downward, changing how society functioned. The plague, in reshaping population, reshaped power. Land once owned by great families was divided or sold. Empty workshops were taken over by new hands. Young men and women stepped into roles their parents never could have imagined. Florence was no longer ruled solely by old bloodlines. It was becoming a city shaped by survivors. The mindset of the people changed as well. Those who lived through the plague carried a deep awareness of life's fragility. Death was no longer an abstract idea. It was personal, familiar, and permanent. This awareness influenced how people thought, worked, and believed. Pleasure, beauty, and meaning became more important. Life was short, and it needed to matter. Religion did not disappear, but it evolved. Blind faith had failed to protect the city, and people began questioning authority, tradition, and long-held beliefs. This questioning spirit planted seeds that would later grow into intellectual and cultural rebirth. Florence was slowly turning toward a new way of thinking, one that valued human experience, observation, and creativity. In time, art began to flourish again, not immediately and not joyfully, but with purpose. Pain, death, and survival became themes that artists explored openly. Writers described real human emotion rather than distant religious ideals. The trauma of the plague demanded expression. From this need, Florence would eventually rise as the heart of the Renaissance. The Black Death had destroyed the old Florence, but it also cleared space for something new. The city rebuilt itself not by returning to what it had been, but by becoming something different. Stronger in some ways, wiser in others, forever marked by loss. The memory of the plague remained in stories, laws, and traditions, shaping how future generations understood risk, health, and society. Florence learned a hard lesson. Wealth does not guarantee safety. Faith does not ensure protection, and civilization is more fragile than it appears. But it also learned that even after unimaginable destruction, renewal is possible. The Black Death did not end Florence's story. It divided it into two parts, before the plague and after. And the city that emerged from the ashes would go on to change European history forever. Call to action. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Europe's dark past, subscribe to the channel for more cinematic history stories. Comment below. Which European city's hidden history should we explore next?